Thank you all for watching and supporting my videos. Your encouragement keeps me inspired to create even more content. My next big goal is to reach 1,000 subscribers, and I can't do it without your help. If you enjoy what I create, hit that subscribe button and join me on this journey. Now, let's dive into the stories.
It was a regular delivery. A pizza out of town to the outskirts. It was a regular delivery. A pizza out of town to the outskirts. As usual, I got into the car, started the engine and headed out. It was nothing unusual. I had long gotten used to such deliveries. All those small houses with gardens which seem so cozy, somehow lure you into their surroundings, even if just for a minute. I arrived at the location after half an hour. The house looked like a typical building you could see in any suburb. Night, fog and small lights barely cutting through the darkness. But as I approached the door I heard screams. At first I thought it was just a child or someone from the neighbors, but the closer I got, the more these sounds became like uncontrollable grief, pain and despair. I stopped for a few seconds, started looking around but didn't see anything suspicious. A man opened the door and I handed him the pizza box. He wasn't very tall, had short hair and overall looked normal. But something unsettled me. I couldn't explain why, but there was a feeling that something was wrong. While he was paying, I noticed bloodstains on the floor. Not very noticeable, but they led from the door toward the kitchen. I tried not to pay attention, but it was impossible. The man probably noticed me staring at the stains. He suddenly turned, slightly bending as if trying to hide his hand behind his back. As the door started to close, I accidentally saw his hand. It had blood on it. Not much, but enough to make me uneasy. My first instinct was to take the box and leave, but something made me stay. It wasn't just curiosity, it was intuition. I said I needed to recount the change. The man seemed nervous, though he tried to appear calm. He raised his hand to close the door, but at that moment I decided to peek through the crack. Something wasn't right. Under the light in the background of the kitchen, I saw fragments of clothing, and near the table, there was a large dark stain. It didn't look like a normal scene. I turned around, ready to leave quickly, but then I noticed movement through the window. It was a woman, sitting on the floor near the table, with a swollen face, and her eyes were wide open but expressionless. I couldn't understand what was wrong with her, but her appearance was horrifying. My heart started racing. I couldn't just leave. This was a situation that needed help. I pulled out my phone and called the police, telling them what I had seen. They told me to stay at the scene and I agreed, though I wasn't at ease. I kept watching the house, trying not to do anything that could draw the man's attention. It was strange, the woman wasn't moving and the man became increasingly nervous, pacing around the rooms and occasionally glancing at the window. It was clear he knew I had called the police, and this only heightened my sense of danger. Minutes passed, but for me it felt like an eternity. Then I saw the man quickly approach the woman and try to lift her. Her movements were mechanical, almost automatic, but there was something terrifying about it. It was as if they were trying to hide something. I felt with every passing minute that the situation was becoming more and more dangerous. Finally, the police arrived and I immediately pointed them to the house. They went inside and after a few minutes I heard screams, but not from the woman, it was the sound of a struggle inside. The man was taken away, and the woman was rushed to the hospital. I never found out exactly what happened in that house, but since then, I haven't been able to forget that woman's gaze through the window. Something inside me tells me this was only the beginning of something much more terrifying. The next morning I returned home, struggling to process everything that had happened the day before. The memories of that house wouldn't let me go, the blood on the floor, the woman with that vacant look, the man hiding something from me. It all kept spinning in my mind, not letting me sleep. I never found out what exactly happened in that house, but I felt like this was not the end. Sitting down for breakfast, I turned on the TV to catch the news. At first, I didn't pay much attention to the reports, but then I heard a familiar name. It turned out that the same man I had seen yesterday was in the news. They had found him along with his wife, who was rushed to the hospital with serious injuries. The police confirmed that he had been systematically abusing her for several years, and those bloody stains I had noticed on the floor were part of his efforts to cover up his crimes. It turned out that at the time I had arrived with the pizza, His wife was in very poor condition, she hadn't been able to move without pain for days, and he was trying to hide this from everyone. Even me. This man had been living in a fabricated world, trying to maintain the mask of normalcy, while in reality he had kept his wife captive. It seemed like she could no longer stay silent and was trying to find a way out when I accidentally showed up at their doorstep. This revelation threw me into even deeper shock. I couldn't understand how this could have happened and how little I had noticed. Why hadn't I realized something was wrong earlier? The screams, the blood on the floor, the nervous behavior of the man, all of it was a clue. I felt guilty for not intervening sooner, even though I had called the police. The news also reported that the woman had survived the worst moments of her life and was now safe, but she still had a long road to recovery ahead. The man was charged with abuse and other crimes that had lasted for several years. He was in custody now and he could no longer manipulate his family. The news hit me hard. I couldn't get rid of the image of the woman through the window, her lifeless stare. I was left with the feeling that sometimes life throws situations at us where we don't always understand what's really going on and what price we pay for our inattention. And although I knew I had done the right thing by calling the police, the question remained, could I have done more? It was just another night of delivering pizza. The same routine. I loaded up the bags, checked the order, and headed out to make the deliveries. The weather was cold and clear, typical for late fall, with just a hint of frost in the air. The streets were quieter than usual, and the only sounds were the hum of my car's engine and the soft rustle of the leaves blowing across the road. This time, the order was for a small, suburban neighborhood, one of those areas with narrow streets lined with rows of old houses, each with a well-kept lawn and a porch light on, casting a warm glow onto the darkened road. As I drove, I noticed how peaceful everything seemed. The kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're the only person awake in the world. I arrived at the address after about 15 minutes. The house was tucked at the end of the block, a small two-story with an overgrown yard and a few decorative pumpkins left over from Halloween. Nothing unusual, just an ordinary house. I parked my car in front of it and grabbed the pizza bag, stepping out into the cold air. As I walked up to the front door, I noticed something odd. The porch light flickered as if it was struggling to stay on. I paused for a moment, glancing around, but everything seemed normal. I shrugged it off and rang the doorbell. A few moments later, a woman opened the door. She looked to be in her late 30s, with tired eyes and an uneasy smile. She was wearing an old sweater and sweatpants, and the faint smell of cigarettes lingered in the air. "Good evening," she said, her voice sounding just a bit off, almost like she hadn't spoken to anyone all day. I handed her the pizza and told her the total. She fumbled for her wallet, looking distracted. Something about the whole scene felt strange, but I couldn't put my finger on it. "Are you okay?" I asked, trying to break the silence. "You seem a little off." She paused, looking up at me, her gaze distant. For a second I thought she might tell me something was wrong, but instead she just shook her head. "Just tired," she said, her voice quiet. I nodded, still feeling a little uncomfortable. As she handed me the cash, I noticed the door was cracked open just a bit too much, and I could hear faint noises from inside the house, voices, but they were muffled. It sounded like an argument, but it was hard to make out. "Everything all right in there?" I asked, not sure why I felt the need to ask, but the unease kept growing. Her expression darkened for a moment, and she quickly glanced back over her shoulder toward the living room. Then, without saying another word, she closed the door slightly more and handed me the rest of the payment. "Thanks," she said curtly, her eyes avoiding mine. I stood there for a moment, still trying to figure out what was going on. It wasn't normal to feel this way after a simple delivery, but something felt off, like there was tension in the air. I didn't want to pry further, so I thanked her again and turned to leave. Just as I reached my car, I heard the door open behind me. I turned around, half expecting her to call me back for something, but instead, she was standing in the doorway with her hand on the frame, staring at me. She didn't say anything. She just watched as I climbed into the car and drove away. I thought about it the entire way back to the restaurant. Something about that woman's behavior didn't sit right with me, but I had no solid reason to make a bigger issue out of it. Maybe I was just overthinking it. Still, as I turned onto the main road, I couldn't shake the feeling that I should have done something more. Maybe asked more questions, maybe stayed a little longer, but I didn't. The next day, I was scrolling through my phone during a break when I saw a headline in the local news. It was about the woman I had delivered to the night before. Apparently, she had been reported missing by her family. Her husband, who had been absent the previous night, was now under investigation for potential involvement in her disappearance. The details were vague, but it seemed that she had been struggling in her marriage for some time, and there were rumors of emotional abuse. Her family had tried to contact her multiple times over the past few days but hadn't heard anything. The police were asking anyone who might have seen her or interacted with her recently to come forward. I froze as I read the article. It hit me then, those faint noises I'd heard coming from inside the house the night before had been more than just an argument. I didn't know what was really going on, but the woman's strange behavior, her distant demeanor, and the quick glance she had given over her shoulders suddenly made sense. She had been hiding something, or maybe she had been trying to tell me something but didn't know how. I wasn't sure if I could have done anything more, but I wished I had trusted my instincts. I couldn't stop thinking about her standing in that doorway, looking at me as if she were silently pleading for help. The news about her disappearance stayed with me for weeks. I never saw her face in the news again, and I never got any answers. But every time I made a delivery to that neighborhood, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, and I wondered if I could have done more to help. The guilt lingered, and it haunted me each time I thought about that night, that one delivery that felt like nothing at the time, but later turned out to be so much more. A few weeks passed since that night, but I couldn't shake the memory of the woman and the eerie feeling that something was wrong. Every time I got an order for that same neighborhood, my heart would race and I'd hesitate before driving in. I kept wondering if I had missed something, if there was more to the story that I hadn't realized at the time. One evening, I received another delivery to the same street. The house was just a few doors down from where I had gone before. I hesitated for a moment, but the order was already processed and I needed the shift, so I got in my car and drove. When I arrived, the house looked different. It wasn't just the overgrown lawn or the dim porch light that caught my attention, it was the complete silence. No flickering light, no movement inside, and no sounds of life. It felt almost abandoned. My stomach twisted as I approached the door. I rang the doorbell, and after a few moments, a man opened it. He was in his mid-40s, tall, with graying hair and a serious, weathered look. His eyes were distant, almost cold. He didn't seem familiar, and his face didn't hold any expression as he greeted me. "Pizza?" I said, trying to stay calm. He nodded without saying much and handed me the cash. As I took the payment and handed him the pizza, I noticed something strange. His hands were shaking slightly. It was subtle, but it was there. I tried not to stare, but I couldn't help it. The man's posture was stiff, as if he was trying to control something deep inside of him. "Everything okay?" I asked before I could stop myself. It felt like the right question, but at the same time, I knew it might be too much. He looked at me, a little surprised, but quickly regained his composure. "Yeah, fine," he said flatly. He paused for a moment and then added, "Just been a rough week, that's all." I nodded, sensing there was more to his story. But I didn't press it. There was something about his demeanor that told me pushing further might not be wise. As I turned to leave, I heard something behind me. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable, faint footsteps. I glanced over my shoulder and saw a woman standing in the doorway just inside the house, looking at me. She wasn't the same woman from before. She was younger, maybe in her late 20s, with dark hair tied up in a loose bun and wearing a worn-out t-shirt. But there was something about her expression that felt off. Her eyes were hollow, distant, almost like she wasn't fully there. I quickly looked back at the man, who had already turned and was heading back into the house, as if he didn't notice her standing there. But I did. I saw the way her eyes followed him, the way she barely moved, as if rooted to the spot. I didn't know why, but a chill ran down my spine. Something about her presence felt wrong, like a part of her was trapped. I couldn't shake the thought that she might be hiding something, or worse, she might be in danger. As I made my way back to my car, I glanced one more time at the house, feeling like there was a story here that I wasn't seeing. A story that was still unfolding, but in a way I couldn't quite grasp. The next day, I decided to do something I hadn't done before. I checked the news. I didn't expect to find anything, but I had a gut feeling. I searched the local news website and sure enough, I found a report that seemed to confirm my suspicions. The woman I had seen in the doorway was, in fact, the same one who had been reported missing a few weeks ago. The article mentioned that she had been found by the police, but her condition was disturbing. She had been living with severe psychological trauma, and there were signs of abuse, both physical and emotional. It turned out that the man I had delivered to the night before wasn't just a husband, but also her abuser. The report mentioned that the woman had been trying to escape for a long time, but had been too afraid to do so. It was likely that the man had been controlling her every move, keeping her isolated, and making sure she didn't have the chance to reach out for help. The authorities had found her hidden away in that same house, but she hadn't been able to speak much. Her mind was shattered, and it seemed like she had been too broken to even ask for help when I was there. Reading the article felt like a punch in the gut. I knew I had seen something strange, but I never imagined it was this serious. I had a moment of clarity. I could have done more. I could have pushed the man, asked more questions, or even tried to make her feel like she could talk to me. But I hadn't. The police had arrested the man, and he was facing multiple charges of abuse and possibly worse. As for the woman, they were giving her the support she needed, but it was clear that it was going to be a long road to recovery. I kept thinking about that night, the strange silence, the look in the woman's eyes, and the man's odd behavior. I wasn't sure if I could have saved her, but I knew one thing for sure. Sometimes just being aware and trusting your instincts could make a difference. Even when you're just a pizza delivery driver. I didn't want to keep delivering to that neighborhood. But I knew I couldn't forget what had happened. And maybe, just maybe, I would learn to trust my gut more in the future. The days after the discovery were filled with a strange sense of guilt and confusion. I couldn't stop thinking about the woman and the man, the whole situation. It felt like something I should have been able to prevent. But I didn't know how. I was just a delivery driver after all. Who was I to get involved in people's lives like that? A few weeks passed and I found myself back in the same neighborhood, delivering pizzas again. I had tried to avoid it, but there was no way around it. It was just a part of my job. My route had changed slightly, but this time I had to go down that same street again. My heart sank when I recognized the familiar house in the distance. This time, though, the house looked different. The front yard was cleaner and there were new plants around the door. There was no eerie silence, no feeling of abandonment. It seemed like life had returned. But something was still off. I couldn't explain it, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It wasn't just the house. It was the people living there. I pulled up in front of the house, took a deep breath, and got out of the car. I rang the doorbell and waited. Moments later, the door creaked open, and to my surprise, it was the woman, the one I had seen standing at the door a few weeks ago. She looked different now, healthier, though still a little distant. She seemed like a shadow of her former self, but there was something else. A sense of calm, a quiet resilience. "Pizza?" I said, trying not to sound too awkward. She gave me a small smile and nodded. "Thanks," she said softly, taking the pizza box from me. Her voice was steady, but there was an underlying sadness in it. I handed her the pizza and, against my better judgment, asked, "How are you doing?" Her smile faltered for a second, and she seemed to hesitate before answering. "I'm okay. I'm working on it. It's not easy, but I'm getting there." She looked down at the ground for a moment as if searching for the right words. Then she met my eyes. "You were the one who called the police, weren't you?" I froze, unsure of how to respond. I didn't know if I should admit it, if it was the right thing to do. But she seemed to be waiting for an answer, her eyes full of gratitude. I nodded slowly. "Yeah. I didn't know what was going on, but something didn't feel right. I just called." She nodded, her expression softening. "I don't know if you realize how much that helped. It took so much for me to finally get out. But your call, it gave me a chance. I wasn't able to speak up before, but I wanted to. I just couldn't." She paused as if gathering her thoughts. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to thank you enough." I felt a lump form in my throat. "I'm just glad you're safe," I said quietly. She smiled again, but this time it was more genuine. "I'm trying to rebuild piece by piece. But it's going to take time. I'm getting counseling and I'm learning to live again. It's a process, but I'm not alone anymore. I nodded, feeling a weight lift off my chest. There was something reassuring in the way she spoke, as if she had found a way to move forward. And in that moment, I realized that sometimes the smallest actions, things we don't even think twice about, can change someone's life. Before I could say anything else, she added, "I've decided to move. I can't stay here anymore, not after everything that happened. I need a fresh start. It's time." I understood. It must have been hard to stay in the same place after everything that had occurred. But I knew it was for the best. She needed to find peace. I turned to leave, but she called out to me. "Wait. I've got something for you." I turned back in surprise. She walked inside for a moment and returned with a small envelope. She handed it to me with a faint smile. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said again. "It's not much, but it's the least I can do." I took the envelope and, without looking inside, tucked it into my jacket pocket. "You don't have to do that," I said, but she waved me off. "You gave me a chance. I can't forget that." I nodded, unable to find the right words. As I walked back to my car, I felt a sense of relief I hadn't realized I was waiting for. The weight of the situation had lifted, not because it was over, but because she was taking control of her life. There was still a long road ahead, but at least now she was walking it with strength. As I started the car and drove away, I glanced at the envelope. I hadn't opened it yet, but I figured it was time. I pulled it out, noticing it was handwritten, and carefully opened it. Inside was a small thank you note, but there was also a check, one that was more than generous. I smiled to myself. It wasn't about the money. It never had been. It was about knowing that, even in the smallest of ways, I had been a part of something that helped her take back control. That was enough. As I drove down the road, I knew one thing for sure. The next time I had a gut feeling about something, I wouldn't ignore it. Life sometimes forces us to make choices, but it's how we respond that defines us. I had made the right call, and that would stay with me. As I continued driving, the landscape blurred outside the window. The evening sun dipped behind the horizon, casting a warm glow across the empty road. I could still feel the weight of the envelope in my pocket, a reminder of the unexpected turn my life had taken, and of how small moments can sometimes carry far-reaching consequences. The house I had just left now seemed like a distant memory, something I could never truly forget but could let fade in time. Life was moving on, and I was learning that sometimes there's nothing more powerful than listening to that quiet voice inside, trusting your instincts and taking action when it matters. Back at home that night, I set the envelope on the kitchen counter. The words she had said echoed in my mind, reminding me that even when we feel powerless, our actions can make a real difference. I didn't expect a thank you. I didn't expect any reward. But there it was, a gesture of appreciation that meant more than any words ever could. I put the check in a drawer, deciding it wasn't something I needed right now. What mattered more was knowing that someone had found the strength to leave behind their darkness, to start over, and to live for themselves again. That was the real gift, and it was one that would stay with me forever. As I sat down to eat dinner, I thought about how life had a way of testing us. It doesn't always ask for grand gestures or heroic acts. Sometimes, it only asks for us to do what feels right in our hearts. It had been a simple delivery, one I'd done hundreds of times before, but it had turned into something I would never forget. I finished my meal in silence, reflecting on the journey, both mine and hers. The road ahead, I knew, was never straight. It was full of twists, turns, and moments where everything could change in an instant. But I felt ready for whatever came next. And with that thought, I closed my eyes, letting the peaceful quiet of the evening settle over me. The past would always be a part of me, but I had learned to let go of what I couldn't change and embrace the moments that mattered. That's all anyone could really do.